Judge Patricia Delacroix hadn't slept in 3 days. The exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, settling into the lines of her face and the hollows beneath her eyes. She sat in her chambers at the Hamilton County Courthouse in Cincinnati, the afternoon light casting long shadows across her mahogany desk. Before her lay a stack of case files, but only one consumed her thoughts: the Mitchell custody case. Emma Mitchell, age 3 years old, had become the center of the most perplexing and heartbreaking situation Judge Delacroix had encountered in her 23 years on the bench. The judge removed her reading glasses and rubbed her temples, replaying the initial hearing in her mind. Emma had been present that day too, silent and hollow-eyed, dressed in a small lavender dress that her grandmother had carefully chosen. The little girl had sat between her two parents, who couldn't even look at each other without contempt radiating from every fiber of their beings. Emma hadn't spoken a single word, not even when the judge had leaned forward and asked her directly, in the gentlest voice she could muster, "Emma, sweetheart, who do you want to live with?" Nothing, just silence. The court-appointed psychiatrist's report lay on Judge Delacroix's desk, and she pulled it closer now, reading the conclusion again for what felt like the 100th time. The patient presents with symptoms consistent with severe selective mutism and complex PTSD. Possible trauma etiology. Further evaluation recommended. Patient has ceased all verbal communication with both parents as of 3 weeks prior to initial assessment. 3 weeks. Something had happened 3 weeks before the first court hearing that had stolen this child's voice entirely. Robert Mitchell, Emma's father, claimed that his ex-wife Sarah was mentally unstable, that she had turned Emma against him through parental alienation and psychological manipulation. His attorney had presented character witnesses, his boss, his neighbor, even his gym trainer. Everyone testified that Robert was a devoted father, a stable presence, a man of good character. He wanted shared custody. He wanted equal time with his daughter. Sarah Mitchell, Emma's mother, told a completely different story. Her voice had shaken as she testified, tears streaming down her face, that Robert had a violent temper, that he had screamed at Emma, called her names, and on one occasion had grabbed her so forcefully that she'd fallen. Sarah claimed that Emma's mutism was a direct result of witnessing her father's rage. But here was the problem. Emma wouldn't confirm any of it. How could the court take a mother's word against a father's when the only witness, the child herself, refused to speak? Judge Delacroix had ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation. She'd mandated that both parents complete anger management classes. She'd reviewed school reports from Emma's preschool, which indicated behavioral regression, nightmares, and increasing anxiety. The preschool director had noted that Emma's condition had deteriorated significantly after visitations with her father, but this was subjective observation, not concrete evidence that would hold up in a custody determination. The judge stood and walked to the window of her chambers, looking out at the Cincinnati skyline. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, Emma Mitchell was sleeping, or not sleeping. The judge wondered if the little girl had nightmares. She wondered if Emma felt safe anywhere in the world. That was when Judge Delacroix made a decision that would later be scrutinized, debated, and ultimately praised by legal experts and child psychologists across the nation. It was unconventional. It was risky. It might be overturned on appeal. But it was the only thing she could think of that might give Emma a voice when her own voice had abandoned her. She spent the next hour researching trauma-certified police dogs. She read case studies. She reviewed scientific literature about how animals trained in trauma response could facilitate emotional disclosure in children. She found Officer Marcus Chen's name repeated across multiple papers and news articles. A decorated K-9 handler with a German Shepherd named Duke, who had helped dozens of children in similarly traumatic situations communicate about their experiences. By the time Judge Delacroix finished her research, it was midnight. She was energized despite her exhaustion. She was convinced this was the right call. The next morning, she contacted Officer Chen's department. The conversation was brief but intense. Chen was initially skeptical. This wasn't standard courtroom procedure and there would certainly be legal challenges. But when Judge Delacroix explained Emma's situation, his tone shifted. "I'll be there," he said simply. "Duke and I have helped children before. We'll help her if we can." Word spread quickly through the courthouse. By the time the official notice was filed, announcing that a police dog would be present at the Mitchell custody hearing, the reactions were immediate and divided. Some legal colleagues congratulated Judge Delacroix for her creative thinking. Others whispered that she'd lost her mind. One judge even stopped her in the hallway and said bluntly, "Patricia, this is going to get thrown out. You're introducing an animal into a family court proceeding. It's ridiculous." But Judge Delacroix stood firm. "We have a 3-year-old girl who cannot speak," she'd replied quietly. "Traditional methods have failed. If this helps her find her voice, then we do it." The media caught wind of the story. Within 48 hours, news vans were stationed outside the courthouse. Reporters were running segments on the evening news about the dog judge and her controversial decision. Some outlets were sympathetic, framing it as innovative and compassionate. Others were harsh, questioning the judge's competence and suggesting she was engaging in psychological gimmickry. Sarah Mitchell reached out to Judge Delacroix's chambers, requesting a private meeting. When they sat down in the judge's office, Sarah was barely holding together. "Do you really think Duke can help her talk?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Do you really believe my daughter will tell the truth?" "I don't know," Judge Delacroix had answered honestly. "But I know that Emma is trapped in silence, and we need to try something different. Sometimes the most powerful healing comes from unexpected sources." Robert Mitchell, by contrast, filed a motion to have the hearing postponed, claiming that the introduction of an animal constituted an unfair bias against him and a violation of his right to a fair trial. His attorney argued passionately that a dog had no place in a court of law. The motion was denied. Now, as Judge Delacroix sat in her chambers the morning of the hearing, watching the clock approach 9 a.m., she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. Outside her office, she could hear the commotion. Reporters, attorneys, curious onlookers gathering in the corridors. In less than an hour, Officer Marcus Chen and Duke would arrive. In less than an hour, they would see if a traumatized 3-year-old girl could find her voice in the presence of a specially trained dog. Judge Delacroix took a deep breath, straightened her robes, and whispered a prayer, something she rarely did. "Let her speak," she whispered. "Please let her speak." When she opened her office door and walked toward the courtroom, she had no idea what was about to unfold. She had no idea that the next few hours would change not just Emma's life, but the entire landscape of family law in America. She had no idea that a simple whisper from a 3-year-old girl to a police dog would become the most significant piece of testimony ever delivered in her courtroom. All she knew was that she was about to find out if hope was enough. The courtroom doors opened at precisely 9:47 a.m., and Emma Mitchell entered the room like a small, fragile ghost. Her grandmother, Patricia Sullivan, held her hand firmly but gently, as if afraid that any moment the child might vanish entirely. Emma wore a pale pink dress with white socks pulled up to her knees and patent leather shoes that clicked softly against the polished floor with each step. In her other hand, she clutched a stuffed rabbit, its gray fur worn smooth from constant handling, one ear slightly torn from being pulled at repeatedly. The rabbit was named Mr. Hoppers, and Emma had brought it everywhere for the past 3 months, ever since she'd stopped speaking. Judge Delacroix observed the child from her elevated bench. Emma's blonde curls were perfectly arranged, her appearance meticulously maintained by a grandmother who was desperately trying to make everything normal, everything okay, everything fine. But the judge could see through the facade. She could see the tremor in the child's hands. She could see how Emma's eyes darted around the courtroom like those of a hunted animal, taking in the tall ceilings, the dark wood paneling, the rows of seating filled with strangers. The child looked terrified. Officer Marcus Chen stood to the side with Duke, allowing everyone to become accustomed to the dog's presence before the proceedings officially began. The German Shepherd was magnificent, all muscle and intelligent eyes, but more importantly, he was calm. Absolutely, completely calm. His breathing was steady and measured. His body language was open and non-threatening. He wore no muzzle, no aggression harness, just a simple collar and leash. To anyone observing, he looked like a well-trained family pet, not a specialized trauma response animal. That was precisely the point. Robert Mitchell sat at the left table with his attorney, Leonard Hawthorne, a sharp-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and an expression of absolute confidence. Robert himself was an attractive man, tall, well-groomed, with kind eyes that seemed incapable of harboring any darkness whatsoever. He wore an expensive suit, tailored perfectly. His tie was silk. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. To look at him, you would never imagine that a 3-year-old girl might be terrified of this man. That was precisely the problem. Sarah Mitchell sat at the right table with her attorney, Jennifer Ackafer, a black woman in her early 40s with fierce intelligence and a protective demeanor. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed from crying. She had lost weight. You could see it in the hollowness of her cheeks and the way her blouse hung slightly loose on her frame. She looked at Emma with such longing, such desperate hope, that it was almost painful to witness. But she remained seated, understanding that any sudden movement might startle the child further. Judge Delacroix gavelled the session to order at 9:50 a.m. This court is now in session. The case of Mitchell versus Mitchell, custody matter, case number 2024 CV8847. We are reconvening for the purpose of obtaining testimony from the minor child, Emma Mitchell, regarding her preferences and experiences with both parents. The judge paused, her eyes moving to Emma. I want everyone in this courtroom to understand that this child's well-being is the only thing that matters here today. We will proceed with compassion, patience, and sensitivity. Sarah's attorney stood first. Jennifer Ackafer had spent the previous evening preparing her questions with meticulous care. They were gentle. They were open-ended. They were designed to elicit information without leading the child or putting words in her mouth. Emma, sweetheart, Jennifer began, her voice warm and inviting. Can you tell the court about your time with your mommy? What do you like to do with her? Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Emma stared at her shoes. Her small fingers wrapped more tightly around Mr. Hopper's. Her grandmother's hand tightened on her shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring but which only emphasized the child's rigidity. 30 seconds passed, then 60. The courtroom felt suffocating. You could hear the scratch of the court stenographer's fingers on her keyboard, recording the silence for the official record. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system. You could hear someone in the gallery shifting their weight uncomfortably in a wooden chair. Emma, honey, Jennifer tried again. Do you remember the last time you saw Mommy? What did you do together? Nothing, not even a whisper, not even a shake of the head. Emma's eyes remained downcast, her body completely shut down. Judge Delacroix made notes on her pad, her expression unreadable but her posture tense. She'd seen reluctant witnesses before, teenagers refusing to testify, adults intimidated by the courtroom setting, but never a child this completely non-responsive. It was as if Emma had turned off a switch inside herself, becoming a silent observer of her own life rather than a participant. Jennifer persisted for another 5 minutes, asking variations of the same questions, trying different approaches, using softer tones and more animated expressions. Nothing worked. Emma remained a statue of silence. Finally, Jennifer sat down, exchanging a worried glance with Sarah. The hope that had flickered across Sarah's face dimmed considerably. Now it was Robert's attorney's turn. Leonard Hawthorne stood with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. If the child wouldn't speak to the mother's attorney, then surely she would remain silent for him as well. This played directly into his strategy. No testimony meant no allegations, and without allegations, There was no evidence of wrongdoing. "Emma," Leonard began, his voice softer than expected, almost grandfatherly, "I'm Mr. Hawthorne. I'm going to ask you some questions, okay? And I want you to know that you can say anything you want to say. There's no wrong answers here. Do you understand?" Emma's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment before returning to her shoes. "Emma, do you love your daddy?" Silence. "Do you like spending time with your daddy?" Silence. "Emma, has anyone ever told you that you shouldn't spend time with your daddy?" Silence. The question hung in the air like a challenge, subtly designed to plant the suggestion that Sarah had been poisoning Emma against her father. But Emma gave no reaction whatsoever. Leonard continued for another 10 minutes, his questions becoming more pointed, his patience visibly wearing thin. A judge or jury might interpret the child's silence as an inability to communicate, but Leonard clearly wanted it to be interpreted as coaching, that Emma had been instructed not to respond. By the time he finally sat down, nearly 20 minutes had elapsed since Emma had entered the courtroom. The tension was suffocating. Judge Delacroix could see the frustration building in Robert's posture, the desperation deepening in Sarah's expression, and the resignation settling over Emma's small shoulders. The judge was about to call for a recess when something extraordinary happened. Emma's eyes suddenly shifted, not slowly, not gradually, but with sudden, focused intensity. Her entire body went rigid. Every muscle seemed to tense at once. Her grandmother leaned down. "Emma, are you okay, sweetheart?" But Emma wasn't looking at her grandmother. She wasn't looking at either of her parents. She wasn't looking at any of the attorneys or the judge or the court reporter. She was looking directly at Duke. The German shepherd's ears perked up immediately, as if responding to a silent signal. His eyes locked with Emma's. Officer Chen felt the shift in the dog's energy, subtle but unmistakable. Something was happening, something significant. Emma stood abruptly, so suddenly that her grandmother gasped. Mr. Hoppers fell to the floor, forgotten. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the child. Robert's attorney began to object. Sarah leaned forward, tears starting to stream down her face again. But Judge Delacroix raised her hand. "Allow it," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the rising commotion. Everyone remained silent. Emma took one small step, then another. Her tiny feet carried her directly toward Officer Chen and Duke. The German shepherd's tail began to wag slowly, deliberately. His body language shifted into a posture of acceptance and welcome. Emma sat down on the courtroom floor, her pink dress spreading around her like a flower, and wrapped her small arms around Duke's neck. And then she began to whisper. Her lips moved rapidly, her words inaudible to anyone except the dog. Her entire body trembled as she whispered urgent secrets into Duke's ear. The German shepherd didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply remained perfectly still, his ears angled forward, his complete attention focused on the terrified child clutching him. Judge Delacroix leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of her bench. Officer Chen's face had gone pale. His hand gripped the leash tightly, but not from fear of the dog, from the sudden understanding of what was happening. The deafening silence that had filled the courtroom for the past 20 minutes was about to be shattered by one small girl's whispered confession. And everyone in that courtroom was about to hear a truth that would change everything. Time seemed to stop in that courtroom. Every person present, attorneys, judge, court reporter, gallery observers, became frozen in a tableau of stunned anticipation. The only movement was Emma's lips moving rapidly against Duke's ear, her small body trembling with the effort of finally releasing words that had been locked inside her for 3 agonizing weeks. Judge Delacroix's breath caught in her throat. She had gambled everything on this moment, and now it was unfolding before her eyes in a way that transcended anything she could have anticipated. The judge removed her glasses slowly, her eyes never leaving the scene before her. She could see Emma's shoulders shaking. She could see how the child's fingers gripped Duke's fur with an intensity that spoke of desperation, of holding onto the only thing in the world that made her feel safe. Officer Marcus Chen's jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles beneath his skin rippled. His free hand was clenched into a fist at his side. He had trained Duke for 7 years, had worked with the dog in countless sensitive situations involving traumatized children, but this moment, this raw, devastating moment, still shook him to his core. He could hear fragments of Emma's whispered words, though he trained himself not to listen too closely. Whatever the child was disclosing needed to remain sacred, a communication between her and the animal who had become her lifeline. Sarah Mitchell's hand covered her mouth, suppressing a sob that was building in her chest. Tears flowed freely down her face now, and her body was shaking with the force of emotion she'd been holding back for months. She had known something was terribly wrong. A mother always knows. But to see her daughter finally breaking her silence, even if that silence was being broken to a dog rather than to the court, was almost too much to bear. Robert Mitchell, by contrast, had gone deathly still. His face had drained of all color, becoming a sickly shade of gray beneath his artificial tan. His attorney, Leonard Hawthorne, was leaning toward him, whispering urgently, but Robert didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were fixed on Emma with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Was it concern? Was it fear? Was it anger? Judge Delacroix made a mental note to observe his reaction carefully. Body language often revealed truths that words could conceal. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The whispers continued. Emma's voice grew slightly louder and fragments of her words became audible to those who were listening closely. Judge Delacroix caught snippets: scared, yelling, arm hurt. The judge's hands gripped the edge of the bench so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Officer Chen could feel Duke's heart rate increasing beneath his hand. The dog's ears were angled forward in absolute focus, his entire being concentrated on the traumatized child clinging to him. This was what Duke had been trained for, what he lived for, these moments of profound connection with children in crisis. The dog's breathing remained steady and measured, communicating through his very presence that whatever Emma was sharing was safe, was acceptable, was understood. At the 12-minute mark, Emma's whispers became slightly more audible. "He grabbed my arm," the child said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying through the courtroom's acoustic space. "It hurt so much." More fragments followed, each one causing visible reactions from the people hearing them. Sarah's hand pressed harder against her mouth, stifling what sounded like a cry of anguish. Jennifer Acaffer, Sarah's attorney, was recording everything in her legal pad, documenting every fragment of testimony that was being offered. This was extraordinary, unconventional certainly, but potentially the most powerful testimony yet given in this case. Judge Delacroix's expression had shifted from focused observation to something darker, something more protective and angry. The judge had seen many terrible things in her 23 years on the bench, but hearing a 3-year-old girl describe her suffering in whispered fragments was uniquely heartbreaking. The judge found herself gripping her gavel so tightly that she was afraid she might snap it. At the 15-minute mark, Emma's voice grew slightly stronger, as if the act of finally speaking, even if only to a dog, was unlocking something inside her. "Closet," she whispered. "Dark." The word dark was repeated several times, each repetition filled with such profound fear that it seemed to echo through the courtroom like the cry of a wounded animal. Robert suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is absurd," he shouted, his voice breaking with what might have been anger or panic. It was impossible to tell which. "She's clearly been coached. This is a travesty. My attorney should be allowed to." "Sit down, Mr. Mitchell." Judge Delacroix's voice cut through his outburst like a blade. Her tone left no room for argument, no room for negotiation. It was the voice of absolute authority, the voice of a judge who had heard enough. Robert's attorney yanked him back down into his seat, hissing urgent warnings about contempt of court. Emma flinched at Robert's outburst, her small body tensing against Duke. But the dog's response was immediate and perfect. Duke made a soft whimpering sound, something between a comfort and an acknowledgement, and pressed his weight slightly more firmly against the child. The message was clear. I'm here. You're safe. Keep talking. At the 17-minute mark, the most devastating fragment emerged from Emma's whispers. He said Mommy would go away. The child's voice broke on the words. He said if I told anyone, Mommy would disappear forever. The courtroom erupted in gasps and exclamations. Judge Delacroix gavelled sharply, demanding silence, but the damage was done. That single sentence, that terrible, heartbreaking revelation, had shifted the entire energy of the proceeding. This wasn't a case of parental alienation or a child being coached to favor one parent over another. This was a case of psychological manipulation and abuse. Sarah's attorney was on her feet, objecting to the emotional response, but also vigorously documenting everything. Leonard Hawthorne was frantically conferring with Robert, whose face had become almost purple with what appeared to be rage or panic or both. At the 18-minute mark, Emma's whispers began to slow. Her body, which had been rigid with tension, began to relax slightly. She continued speaking, but the urgency in her voice seemed to be diminishing, as if a pressure valve had finally been opened and some of the pressure was being released. Officer Chen could feel the shift in Duke's body as well. The dog seemed to understand that the critical disclosure phase was ending. His body language shifted from intense focus to protective comfort. He adjusted his position slightly to make himself more comfortable for the child, clearly signaling that she could remain here for as long as she needed. At the 20-minute mark, Emma's whispers stopped entirely. She remained curled against Duke, her small body nestled into the dog's warm fur, but she was no longer speaking. Her face was buried against the dog's neck, and her shoulders were moving rhythmically. She was crying now, deep, silent sobs that shook her entire frame. Judge Delacroix let the silence continue for a full minute, understanding that this moment needed to exist in its own space, uninterrupted and honored. Then very quietly she said, "Officer Chen, please remain with the child for as long as necessary. Court is in recess. Everyone else will remain in the courtroom." As Officer Chen knelt down beside Emma and Duke, providing his own supportive presence, Judge Delacroix stood and walked back into her chambers, closing the door quietly behind her. She walked to her window and looked out at the Cincinnati skyline, but she wasn't really seeing it. She was seeing a 3-year-old girl who had finally found the courage to speak her truth. And she was already mentally preparing for what would come next. Officer Marcus Chen remained kneeling beside Emma and Duke for what felt like an eternity, but was actually only 7 minutes. The child had stopped crying, though her body still trembled with occasional aftershocks of emotion. Duke had shifted into what Chen called his comfort mode, his massive body providing a warm, solid presence that seemed to anchor the traumatized child to reality. The dog's breathing was perfectly synchronized with Emma's, a phenomenon that Chen had observed countless times but which never ceased to amaze him. It was as if Duke was teaching the child how to breathe through her pain, one synchronized breath at a time. The courtroom had fallen into an eerie quiet. The gallery observers sat motionless, processing what they had witnessed. Sarah Mitchell remained seated at her table, her entire body shaking with suppressed sobs. Jennifer Acaffer sat beside her, one hand rubbing Sarah's back in slow, circular motions, offering what comfort she could. Across the room, Robert Mitchell sat with his attorney in urgent, hushed conversation. Leonard Hawthorne's face had become a mask of controlled fury, his fingers stabbing at notes on his legal pad with aggressive intensity. Judge Delacroix had returned to her chambers only briefly, just long enough to splash cold water on her face and collect herself. She knew that what came next would be crucial. The testimony that had just been delivered, fragmented, whispered, and technically inadmissible under traditional rules of evidence, would need to be properly documented and verified. She needed to move carefully, following proper legal procedure while simultaneously protecting a child who had just taken an enormous emotional and psychological risk. When Judge Delacroix returned to the bench at 10:37 a.m., her expression was grave and her posture was rigid with controlled authority. She looked directly at Officer Chen, who had helped Emma to her feet but maintained a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Officer Chen," the judge said, her voice carrying the weight of the moment, "I'm going to ask you to step forward to the witness stand. I have some questions for you regarding what you observed." Leonard Hawthorne was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, I object. Whatever communication occurred between the child and the animal is hearsay at best and completely unreliable at worst. Officer Chen cannot testify to what the child said because he cannot verify accuracy, context, or truthfulness. This is precisely why we have strict rules of evidence." "Sit down, Mr. Hawthorne," Judge Delacroix said coolly. "Officer Chen will not be testifying to the content of what the child said. He will be testifying to his observations as a trained professional regarding the child's emotional and psychological state. That is entirely admissible. Please proceed, officer." Chen walked to the witness stand, Duke remaining at his side. The judge gestured for Duke to sit, and the dog immediately complied, settling onto the floor beside the witness box with perfect obedience. There was something powerful about the image. A massive German shepherd, trained and controlled, sitting silently beside a law enforcement officer in a courtroom. It made a statement without words being spoken. Judge Delacroix leaned forward slightly. "Officer Chen, you have been working with trauma-certified K9s for how long?" 15 years, Your Honor," Chen replied, his voice steady and professional. 7 of those years specifically with Duke, my current partner." "And in that time, how many children have you worked with who have experienced trauma?" "Approximately 247 documented cases," Chen said, "ranging from physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and witnessing domestic violence." "Thank you. Now, Officer Chen, I want to ask you about the behavioral indicators you observe in Duke when he's interacting with a child who is experiencing acute trauma or who has disclosed abuse. Can you describe those indicators?" Leonard Hawthorne stood again. "Your Honor, this is leading the witness and also attempts to establish Duke's behavior as some kind of scientific indicator of abuse, which has no basis in admissible evidence." "Mr. Hawthorne," Judge Delacroix said, her tone taking on an edge of steel, "Officer Chen is being asked to describe what he observes as a trained professional. This is foundational testimony that will help the court understand what occurred in this courtroom. If you continue to interrupt, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Leonard said through gritted teeth, sitting back down heavily. Chen took a breath. When Duke interacts with a child who is disclosing trauma or abuse, there are several subtle behavioral shifts. First, his ears will move to a specific angle forward and slightly inward. His breathing pattern changes to mirror the child's breathing, which has a calming effect. His body becomes completely still, almost rigid, to avoid any movements that might startle the child. His eyes maintain intense, unwavering focus on the child's face. And finally, there's a phenomenon we call pressure sensing. Duke will adjust his body weight and positioning to provide physical comfort and grounding to the child. "And did you observe all of these indicators with Emma Mitchell today?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Chen said, "immediately and consistently throughout the entire disclosure period." "In your professional experience, Officer Chen, how reliable are these behavioral indicators?" "Extremely reliable, Your Honor. We've tested Duke extensively. His accuracy rate in identifying children who have experienced trauma is 97.3%. That's higher than many conventional psychological assessment tools." The statement hung in the air like a bomb that had just been detonated. 97.3%. Judge Delacroix noted that Sarah's attorney was furiously writing this down, while Leonard Hawthorne's face had become increasingly mottled with anger. Officer Chen, Judge Delacroix continued, I want to be very clear about something. I am not asking you to tell me what Emma said, nor am I asking you to verify the accuracy of her statements. What I am asking is, based on Duke's behavioral responses, can you conclude with professional certainty that Emma was disclosing genuine trauma and distress? Chen's eyes were steady and unflinching. Yes, Your Honor, without question. The behavioral constellation that I observed from Duke is consistent with a child disclosing legitimate, significant trauma. Duke doesn't respond this way to coach children. He doesn't respond this way to children who are being manipulated. His responses are keyed to genuine psychological and emotional distress. Thank you, Officer Chen. You may step down. But before Chen could move, something extraordinary happened. Emma, who had been standing silently beside her grandmother, suddenly made a sound, a small whimper, almost like she was calling to Duke. The dog immediately stood and moved to her, pressing his head gently against her leg. Emma wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The gallery erupted in emotion. Sarah was openly crying now. Several observers dabbed at their own eyes. Even Judge Delacroix found herself blinking back tears, though she maintained her judicial composure. Officer Chen guided Emma and Duke back to a more appropriate position in the courtroom, and the child remained in physical contact with the dog, her small hand gripping his collar as if it were a lifeline. Judge Delacroix looked directly at Robert Mitchell, and when their eyes met, something passed between them, a moment of absolute understanding. The judge's expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to something darker, something more protective and accusatory. Then she did something that would later be cited in legal journals and child advocacy publications across the country. She called for an immediate emergency recess and issued an extraordinary order. Bailiff, please ensure that Emma Mitchell does not leave this building without CPS supervision. I am ordering an immediate, comprehensive protective evaluation of this child. I am also ordering that Officer Chen and Duke remain available throughout this process. Mr. Mitchell, you will have no unsupervised contact with this child until further notice from this court. Is that understood? Robert's attorney jumped to his feet, shouting objections. Robert himself looked like he was going to explode, his face purple with rage. But Judge Delacroix had already gavelled the session into recess, and her chamber's door was closing behind her. The moment everything changed had arrived. And the reverberations were only just beginning. The Cincinnati Child Protective Services office occupied the third floor of the Hamilton County Social Services building, a relatively modern facility with soft lighting and furniture, designed to be non-threatening to children. It was here that Emma Mitchell would spend the next 72 hours undergoing the most comprehensive trauma evaluation ever conducted on her small body and fractured psyche. Judge Delacroix had pulled strings, called in favors, and invoked emergency protocols to ensure that the evaluation would be conducted by the absolute best. Dr. Nathaniel Garrison, a forensic psychologist with 30 years of experience in child trauma cases, and Dr. Rebecca Liu, a pediatric psychiatrist who specialized in complex PTSD in preschool-aged children. Officer Marcus Chen and Duke were present throughout the entire process. This was highly unusual. Typically, evaluators worked alone with the child. But Judge Delacroix's order had been explicit, and both Dr. Garrison and Dr. Liu had agreed that Duke's presence might actually facilitate Emma's ability to communicate. The dog had become her bridge to the world, her translator between the silence that had consumed her and the words that needed to be spoken. The first session began at 2:15 p.m. on that same Tuesday afternoon. Emma sat in a small, child-friendly room decorated with soft colors and gentle artwork. There was a low table with blocks and dolls. There were picture books. There was a comfortable cushioned area where Duke could lie while remaining visible to the child. Officer Chen stood outside the observation window, watching through one-way glass while Dr. Garrison and Dr. Liu worked with Emma. "Emma, sweetheart," Dr. Liu began, her voice warm and patient, "do you remember me? I'm Dr. Rebecca, and this is Dr. Nathaniel. We want to talk to you today about how you're feeling. Is that okay?" Emma nodded slightly, her hand reaching for Duke's collar even though the dog was across the room. Dr. Garrison made a note. Child demonstrates clear attachment to K9. Visible anxiety when physically separated from dog, seeking tactile reassurance. "Emma," Dr. Liu continued, "I know that you talked to Duke earlier today. That was very brave. Do you think you could talk to us too? We're here to listen and to help keep you safe." For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma stared at the floor, her body tense. Then very slowly her eyes moved toward Duke. The dog, as if understanding the child's need, stood and walked across the room, settling down beside Emma. The moment Duke's warm body pressed against her leg, something seemed to shift inside the little girl. "Daddy yells," Emma whispered, her voice so faint that Dr. Liu had to lean forward to hear her. "Daddy yells really loud." "Tell me about that," Dr. Liu said gently, not pushing, simply creating space for the words to emerge. "He yells at Mommy," Emma continued, her voice slightly stronger now. "He calls her bad words, mean words. I don't like those words." Dr. Garrison was writing furiously, documenting everything. Child demonstrates age-appropriate vocabulary, speech patterns consistent with genuine recollection rather than coached statements. Emotional effect matches content. Over the next hour, Emma's story began to unfold in fragments, each piece building a picture of systematic emotional abuse and intimidation. She described her father's rages, how his face would turn red, how his voice would become so loud that it hurt her ears. She described how he would grab her mother's arms during arguments. She described how she would hide in her bedroom, covering her ears with her hands, trying to make the noise stop. And then, hesitantly, she described something that made both doctors exchange a glance of deep concern. "One time," Emma whispered, her entire body trembling, "Daddy was really angry. Mommy said something and he got so angry that he grabbed my arm." Dr. Liu's hand trembled as she wrote, "Can you show me where he grabbed your arm, Emma?" Emma pointed to her left arm, just above the elbow. Dr. Garrison stood and gently examined the area, finding faint bruising that was consistent with fingerprints, adult fingerprints on a child's arm. "It hurt," Emma said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "It hurt so much, I cried, and Daddy got even more angry that I cried. He said I was being a baby. He said I shouldn't cry." Duke pressed more firmly against Emma, and the child wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur while her small body shook with sobs. That was just the beginning. Over the next 2 days, the full extent of Robert Mitchell's abuse emerged. Emma described multiple incidents of physical aggression. She described being locked in a closet as punishment for talking back, a punishment that had lasted for what she estimated as a very long time, but which was likely between 30 minutes to an hour. She described her father telling her repeatedly that if she ever told anyone about what was happening, he would make her mother go away forever. "He said," Emma whispered on the second day of evaluation, "that if I told Mommy or a teacher or anyone, that he would take Mommy away and I would never see her again. He said I would live with him forever and ever and I would be very sad." The psychological impact of this threat became immediately apparent to both doctors. Emma had been psychologically held hostage, threatened with the loss of her mother if she disclosed the abuse. It was a sophisticated, calculated form of manipulation designed to ensure her silence. And it had worked, until the presence of Duke had created a space safe enough for her to finally speak. Officer Chen, watching through the observation window, felt his hands clenching into fists. He had seen many cases of child abuse in his 15 years of work, but the premeditation involved here, the deliberate psychological manipulation of a 3-year-old, was particularly heinous. On the afternoon of the second day, Dr. Garrison and Dr. Liu conducted a private consultation with Officer Chen and Judge Delacroix, who had been receiving regular updates. The conclusions were unambiguous and devastating. "Your Honor," Dr. Garrison said, his expression grim, "this child has experienced documented physical abuse and systematic psychological abuse. The trauma is profound and will require years of therapeutic intervention. However, the good news is that with proper support and separation from the abuser, prognosis for recovery is excellent." "How certain are you of your findings?" Judge Delacroix asked. 99% certain, Dr. Liu said firmly. "The physical evidence corroborates her statements. Her emotional responses are consistent with genuine trauma. Her behavioral patterns match what we see in children who have experienced abuse. And perhaps most importantly, she disclosed these experiences independently and consistently across multiple sessions with different evaluators. This is not a coached child. This is a traumatized child who has finally been given permission to speak the truth." Judge Delacroix leaned back in her chair, her expression darkening. What about the threat she described? The threat that her father made regarding her mother disappearing? "That's actually a documented psychological abuse tactic," Dr. Liu explained. "It's designed to ensure the child's silence through fear. It's extremely effective with young children because their cognitive development doesn't allow them to fully distinguish between realistic threats and exaggerated ones. From Emma's perspective, this threat was absolutely real, and it was absolutely terrifying." On the third day of evaluation, Emma's grandmother came to collect her, not to return her to her father, but to take her to a safe house arranged by CPS. As Emma was leaving the evaluation facility, she did something that neither Dr. Garrison nor Dr. Liu had anticipated. She walked directly to Officer Chen and wrapped her small arms around his legs. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for Duke. Duke saved me." Officer Chen knelt down and held the little girl, and for the first time since Emma's disclosure, he allowed himself to cry. That evening, Judge Delacroix reviewed the complete evaluation report. Every page confirmed what Emma had disclosed. Every page documented the abuse. Every page demanded immediate protective action. The judge knew that what would come next would be contentious, potentially dangerous, and absolutely necessary. Robert Mitchell's world was about to collapse, and Emma Mitchell's healing was about to truly begin. The medical examination room at Cincinnati Children's Hospital was sterile, clinical, and designed to be as non-threatening as possible for pediatric patients. But there was nothing gentle about what Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the hospital's lead pediatric forensic examiner, was documenting as she carefully photographed Emma Mitchell's small body. Each image captured evidence, physical, irrefutable evidence, of abuse inflicted on a child who weighed less than 40 pounds and stood barely 3 feet tall. The bruising on Emma's left arm was the most obvious. 5 distinct finger marks were visible in various stages of healing, ranging from deep purple to yellowish green, indicating that the trauma had occurred at different times rather than in a single incident. Dr. Hernandez measured each mark with meticulous precision, documenting the exact dimensions and location. The spacing between the bruises was consistent with an adult hand forcefully gripping a child's arm. "This is textbook abuse bruising," Dr. Hernandez said quietly to the attending nurse, her voice carrying the controlled anger of a professional who had seen far too many cases like this. "The pattern, the location, the multiple ages of the bruising, all of it tells a story of repeated, intentional infliction of pain." But the physical examination revealed more than just the arm bruising. There was a faint bruise on Emma's shoulder blade, consistent with being roughly grabbed or shoved. There were minor abrasions on her knees, likely from falling while being chased or grabbed. There was a small scar on her right shin that Emma said came from being hit by a chair leg during one of her father's rages. Dr. Hernandez documented everything with clinical precision, taking photographs from multiple angles, measuring dimensions, recording the child's own descriptions of how each injury had been sustained. By the time the examination was complete, she had compiled a photographic record that would be virtually impossible for any competent attorney to dismiss or explain away. "Emma," Dr. Hernandez said gently as she finished her examination, "you've been very brave today. I want you to know that what happened to you was not your fault. None of this was your fault. You did nothing wrong." Emma, who had been holding Duke's collar throughout the entire examination, nodded solemnly. Officer Chen stood nearby, his presence providing both professional observation and emotional support. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still during the entire medical process, his body language communicating calm acceptance to the traumatized child. Simultaneously, while Emma was undergoing her medical examination, CPS investigators were conducting their own investigation into Robert Mitchell's home. Armed with a warrant obtained on the basis of Emma's disclosures and the supporting evaluation reports, they entered the three-bedroom house in the North Side neighborhood where Robert lived with his new girlfriend, a woman named Angela Torres. What they found was damning. In the hallway closet, the closet where Emma had described being locked, investigators found scratches on the interior door frame consistent with a small child's fingernails desperately trying to escape. There were also marks on the door frame indicating that the door had been held shut with significant force. In the master bedroom, they found evidence of the violent arguments that Emma had described. Furniture with damage consistent with being thrown or violently moved, a lamp with a cracked base, and scuff marks on the walls suggesting physical altercations. But perhaps most significantly, they found Robert's diary. The leather-bound journal, discovered on the nightstand beside his bed, contained handwritten entries spanning the previous 8 months. In these entries, Robert described his anger management issues with clinical detachment, documenting incidents where he had lost control. One entry, dated 3 weeks before Emma's initial refusal to speak, read, "Emma was being difficult today. Wouldn't listen to me. Grabbed her arm when she tried to run away, probably gripped too hard. She cried like I'd broken something. Told her if she said anything to Sarah, I would make sure Sarah never saw her again. She needs to understand who's in charge. She needs to learn respect." Another entry, dated 2 weeks later, stated, "Emma's mother has been asking questions. I can tell. The girl must have said something. I've reinforced the message about what will happen to her mother if she keeps talking. She seemed to understand. She's been quieter since then. Good. This needs to stop." The diary entries were a confession, not of one incident, but of a pattern of deliberate, calculated abuse designed to control both the child and her mother through fear and intimidation. By the time the CPS investigation was complete, they had compiled a comprehensive file containing photographic documentation of physical injuries, medical examination reports, the child's detailed disclosures documented across multiple evaluations, forensic psychological evaluations from 2 independent experts, physical evidence from the home environment, Robert's own handwritten confessions in his personal diary, testimony from neighbors about witnessing violent outbursts, school records documenting Emma's behavioral deterioration following visitations with her father, the results of background checks revealing prior incidents of domestic violence. Judge Delacroix reviewed all of this documentation on Thursday morning, less than 48 hours after Emma's initial courtroom disclosure. With each document she read, her expression grew darker, her jaw more clenched, her hands gripping the papers with increasing intensity. By Thursday afternoon, she had made her decision. She issued an emergency order that would change everything. Robert Mitchell was to be taken into custody on charges of child abuse and endangerment. A protective order was issued prohibiting him from any contact with Emma, Sarah, or any witnesses in the case. His passport was seized. His finances were frozen pending investigation. He was ordered to undergo a full psychological evaluation. The arrest took place at 4:47 p.m. on Thursday as Robert was leaving his workplace. Police officers appeared at his office building with a warrant, and the arrest was made in full view of his colleagues. It was humiliating, public, and absolute. That evening, the local news stations ran the story with banner headlines. Local man arrested for child abuse after daughter's shocking courtroom testimony. And police dog helps traumatized child disclose abuse in unprecedented court case. By Friday morning, the story had gone national. News outlets across the country were covering the case, each emphasizing the remarkable role that Officer Chen's service dog had played in finally giving voice to a silenced child. Sarah Mitchell, when informed of Robert's arrest, collapsed into tears, but they were different tears now. They were tears of vindication, of relief, of the overwhelming emotion that comes from finally being believed. Emma, when told that her father could no longer hurt her or her mother, seemed to understand the significance in her own way. She hugged Duke so tightly that the dog made a soft whimper, and she said the words that Officer Chen would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Duke saved us. Duke saved Mommy and me." The physical evidence had been irrefutable. The medical examination had documented the abuse. Robert's own diary had provided his confession, and Emma's courage, facilitated by a trauma-certified German Shepherd, had provided the final, undeniable piece of truth. The moment of justice was approaching, and everyone involved understood that what came next would reshape the legal landscape for children testifying in abuse cases. The evidence of the truth was complete and devastating. And Robert Mitchell's fate was sealed. The courtroom of Judge Patricia Delacroix on Monday morning, March 18, 2024, was unlike anything Cincinnati had ever witnessed. Every seat was filled. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only occupied by journalists, legal scholars, child advocacy representatives, and concerned citizens from across the city. News cameras lined the hallway outside, their operators positioning themselves for the best angles to capture what everyone understood would be a historic moment in family law jurisprudence. Judge Delacroix entered the courtroom at 9:00 a.m. sharp, and the bailiff called the session to order. The judge's expression was grave, her posture rigid with controlled authority. She had reviewed the evidence countless times over the weekend, the photographs, the medical reports, the psychological evaluations, Robert's own diary entries, the CPS investigation results. Every single piece of documentation pointed toward the same inescapable conclusion. This was not a case of parental conflict or custody dispute. This was a case of systematic child abuse. Robert Mitchell sat at the defense table beside his new attorney, Marcus Wellington, a criminal defense specialist who had taken over the case after Leonard Hawthorne had requested to withdraw. Wellington was a skilled litigator, but even he looked grim as he reviewed the mountains of evidence arrayed against his client. There was simply too much. The case was essentially indefensible. Sarah Mitchell sat in the first row of the gallery, flanked by her attorney, Jennifer Ackefer, and her mother. Sarah's face was pale but resolute. Behind her sat Officer Marcus Chen with Duke on a specialized lead designed for courtroom appearances. The dog's presence had been approved by Judge Delacroix, as the judge understood the profound psychological significance of the animal's continued presence for Emma's sense of safety and justice. Emma herself was not present in the courtroom. Judge Delacroix had made the decision that the child would not be required to attend the proceedings or face her abuser. Emma's testimony had already been given, whispered to a dog, documented by trained professionals, corroborated by physical evidence. She had done her part. Now the legal system would do its part. "This court is now in session," Judge Delacroix announced, her voice carrying through the packed courtroom. "We are reconvened in the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell, case number 2024 CV 8847, for the purpose of issuing a final custody determination and addressing charges of child abuse and endangerment brought against Robert Mitchell by the state of Ohio." Marcus Wellington stood. "Your Honor, I would like to make a statement on behalf of my client." "You will have your opportunity," Judge Delacroix said coolly. "But first, this court will present its findings based on the evidence that has been compiled." The judge adjusted her glasses and began reading from a prepared statement. Her voice was measured, but carried an undercurrent of controlled fury that filled the courtroom. After careful review of all evidence presented, including but not limited to comprehensive psychological evaluations of the minor child by Dr. Nathaniel Garrison and Dr. Rebecca Liu, pediatric medical examination, and forensic documentation conducted by Dr. Patricia Hernandez, investigation reports filed by the Cincinnati Division of Child Protective Services, witness testimony, and the documented disclosures made by the minor child, this court finds the following facts to be established by clear and convincing evidence. 1. The minor child, Emma Michelle Mitchell, has been subjected to repeated physical abuse by her biological father, Robert Lawrence Mitchell, including but not limited to forceful grabbing resulting in documented bruising, striking, and confinement in a locked closet. 2. The minor child has been subjected to systematic psychological abuse, including threats designed to ensure her silence through fear that her mother would be removed from her life. 3. The abuse has resulted in documented trauma, selective mutism, behavioral regression, and psychological injury requiring ongoing therapeutic intervention. 4. The abuser has demonstrated no remorse, has documented his abusive conduct in personal writings, and has made no effort to deny or mitigate his actions. 5. The minor child presents with symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, directly attributable to the abuse inflicted by her father. Judge Delacroix paused, removing her glasses momentarily to rub her eyes. When she replaced them, her expression was harder, colder, more determined. Based on these findings, this court issues the following orders. First, all parental rights of Robert Lawrence Mitchell regarding the minor child Emma Michelle Mitchell are hereby temporarily suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings and a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Second, sole legal and physical custody of Emma Michelle Mitchell is awarded to her mother, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. Third, Robert Lawrence Mitchell is prohibited from any contact, direct or indirect, with the minor child. Any violation of this order will result in immediate incarceration for contempt of court. Fourth, all visitation rights are hereby terminated. Any future restoration of visitation rights is contingent upon completion of a comprehensive psychological evaluation, successful completion of anger management and parenting courses, documented evidence of genuine behavioral change over a period of no less than 5 years, and approval by this court based on the best interests of the child. Fifth, the minor child is ordered to receive ongoing psychological and psychiatric care, the costs of which will be covered by the abuser's assets as determined by this court. Judge Delacroix paused and looked directly at Robert Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, you have caused immeasurable harm to a child who could not defend herself, who could not speak, and who had no power to escape your abuse. You deliberately traumatized her. You deliberately threatened her with the loss of her mother to ensure her silence. You documented your own abusive conduct with apparent pride. This court finds your conduct to be among the most reprehensible it has ever witnessed." Robert's face had turned a deep shade of purple. His hands were clenched into fists on the table. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, clearly afraid he might do something that would result in additional charges. This court further notes, Judge Delacroix continued, that the testimony that led to the discovery of this abuse was facilitated by Officer Marcus Chen's trauma-certified service dog, Duke. This case represents a paradigm shift in how we approach testimony from traumatized children. The traditional adversarial process of cross-examination in open court is often re-traumatizing to children who have experienced abuse. The use of trained animals to facilitate emotional disclosure provides an alternative pathway to truth that should be seriously considered by courts across this nation. The judge paused and looked toward Officer Chen and Duke. Officer Chen and Duke have served this court and this child with extraordinary distinction. Their actions have not only helped one child find her voice, they have potentially opened a door for countless other traumatized children who have been silenced by fear and abuse. Judge Delacroix returned her attention to the courtroom at large. This court is also issuing a recommendation that the evidence compiled in this case, along with the documentation of how the service dog facilitated disclosure, be submitted to the Ohio Supreme Court and the American Bar Association for consideration in developing guidelines for the use of trained animals in family court proceedings involving traumatized children. She paused, then made her final statement. To Emma Mitchell, wherever you may be hearing this, you are brave, you are believed, you are safe, you did nothing wrong, what happened to you was not your fault. And because you found the courage to whisper your truth to Duke, you have not only saved yourself, you may have saved countless other children who will benefit from the changes your case has inspired. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Some people cried. Some people stood in silent respect. Robert Mitchell was escorted out by bailiffs, his face contorted with rage and despair. His attorney gathered his papers with a grim expression, knowing that criminal charges would follow, knowing that his client's life as he had known it was over. Sarah Mitchell collapsed into her mother's arms, overwhelmed with emotion. Jennifer Ackefer squeezed her client's shoulder, understanding the magnitude of the moment. Officer Chen knelt beside Duke, and the dog pressed his head against the officer's shoulder, as if understanding that they had just completed something profound and important. Justice had been served, and the system had finally listened to a child who had been voiceless. 18 months had passed since Judge Patricia Delacroix's landmark custody ruling, and Emma Mitchell was unrecognizable, not in physical appearance, though she had grown taller and her blonde curls now fell past her shoulders, but in spirit, in essence, in the fundamental way she moved through the world. The haunted, hollow-eyed child who had entered that courtroom 18 months ago had been replaced by a vibrant, laughing 4-year-old girl who drew pictures with bright colors, played without the weight of fear crushing her shoulders, and slept through the night without the nightmares that had once plagued her. The first months of recovery had been slow and painstaking. Emma's therapist, Dr. Michelle Torres, specialized in childhood trauma and had worked extensively with survivors of abuse. Twice a week, Emma attended therapy sessions in a warm, inviting office decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture. And twice a week, Duke was present, not as a service dog fulfilling an official function, but as Emma's emotional anchor, her tangible connection to the moment when she had finally found her voice. "Tell me about your week, Emma," Dr. Torres would say gently, and Emma would begin to talk. Sometimes the words came easily. Sometimes they came in halting whispers, but they came. The selective mutism that had gripped her for 3 weeks had gradually released its hold, and with each therapy session, Emma's vocabulary expanded, her confidence grew, and her ability to express her emotions became more sophisticated. Officer Marcus Chen attended every session, sitting quietly in the corner while Emma worked with her therapist. He had formed an attachment to the little girl, not as unprofessional or inappropriate, but as someone who understood the magnitude of what she had endured and wanted to ensure that she received the support she needed. Chen had also become something of a local celebrity. Invited to speak at conferences, universities, and law enforcement training programs about the role of trauma-certified K-9s in facilitating disclosure from traumatized children. 6 months into Emma's therapy, something remarkable happened. During a session with Dr. Torres, Emma asked if she could draw a picture. The therapist handed her markers and paper, and Emma spent 30 minutes creating an image. A small blonde figure standing beside a massive German shepherd, both of them surrounded by bright yellow light. Above the figures, Emma had written in careful, large letters, "Duke saved me." "Emma," Dr. Torres asked gently, "can you tell me about this picture?" Duke listened, Emma said, her 4-year-old voice clear and confident. "When nobody else could hear me, Duke heard me, and now I can talk, and now Mommy is safe, and now I'm safe." Dr. Torres had to excuse herself for a moment to compose herself, tears streaming down her face. The simple wisdom of a traumatized child recognizing her own healing was almost too much to bear. By the 9-month mark, Emma had achieved what Dr. Torres described as remarkable progress in emotional regulation, trauma processing, and cognitive reframing. In simpler terms, Emma was healing. The nightmares had decreased from several times per week to perhaps once per month. Her anxiety had become manageable. Her trust in her mother and her grandmother had deepened. And her understanding of what had happened, that it was not her fault, that she had not caused her father's abusive behavior, had become integrated into her developing sense of self. Sarah Mitchell had also undergone profound transformation. The weight she had lost during the custody battle had gradually returned as stress and anxiety decreased. She had returned to her job as a graphic designer, working part-time initially, and then expanding to full-time hours as her confidence grew. She had begun dadding again, cautiously, carefully, with the protective vigilance of a mother who had almost lost custody of her child to an abuser. But she was living again, not merely surviving. Emma's grandmother, Patricia Sullivan, had become the unofficial grandmother of the entire extended legal and therapeutic team that had worked on Emma's case. She brought cookies to CPS offices, sent thank-you notes to Dr. Torres and Dr. Garrison, and had become something of an advocate herself for trauma-informed approaches to child protection. But the most significant ripple effects of Emma's case extended far beyond her immediate family. On the legal front, Judge Delacroix's recommendation had catalyzed a national movement. The Ohio Supreme Court had convened a task force to develop guidelines for the use of trained animals in family court proceedings. The American Bar Association had published a detailed report on the methodology and efficacy of trauma-certified K-9s in facilitating disclosure from traumatized children. By the 18-month mark, 11 states had officially adopted protocols allowing trained service animals in courtrooms when testimony from traumatized children was involved. Law enforcement agencies across the country began developing or expanding their own trauma-certified K-9 programs. Officer Chen received invitations to conduct training seminars in cities from coast to coast. Duke, at 10 years old and beginning to show the first signs of aging, had become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles. Departments were requesting dogs trained using Duke's methodology. Handlers were studying Chen's techniques. Most remarkably, child advocacy organizations began tracking cases in which trauma-certified K-9s had been used. The preliminary data suggested that children who disclosed abuse with the presence of a trained animal had significantly better long-term outcomes than children who disclosed through traditional courtroom procedures. There were lower rates of re-traumatization, better psychological recovery, and higher accuracy in testimony. Emma's case had literally changed the way the legal system approached testimony from traumatized children. 18 months after the custody ruling, a special ceremony was organized. Judge Delacroix had coordinated with the Cincinnati Police Department and various child advocacy organizations to honor Officer Chen and Duke's contributions to child protection and legal innovation. The event was held in the same courthouse where Emma had first whispered her truth to the German Shepherd. The courtroom was filled with dignitaries, law enforcement officers, judges, child protection advocates, and media representatives. Judge Delacroix gave a lengthy speech about the importance of innovation in protecting vulnerable populations and about the power of compassion in the legal system. Officer Chen received a formal commendation from the Cincinnati Police Department. Duke received a Medal of Service, an honor typically reserved for human officers. But the most emotional moment came when Emma was invited to the podium. Now 4 years old, tall enough that Judge Delacroix had to adjust the microphone down to accommodate her height, Emma stood before the assembled crowd. Her blonde curls were braided. She wore a pink dress with white socks and patent leather shoes, the same outfit she had worn the day she entered the courtroom 18 months ago. But this time, there was confidence in her posture, clarity in her expression, and strength in her voice. "My name is Emma Mitchell," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "A long time ago, I couldn't talk. I was scared. But Duke listened to me. Duke heard my whispers when nobody else could hear. Duke helped me find my voice again." She paused, looking directly at Officer Chen and Duke, who sat in the front row of the gallery. "I want to say thank you to Officer Chen and Duke. Thank you for listening. Thank you for saving me and my mommy. Duke is the bravest dog in the whole world. Duke is a hero." The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Delacroix was openly crying. Officer Chen had his arm around Duke's neck, his own face wet with tears. Sarah Mitchell stood and applauded, her mother beside her, both of them overwhelmed with emotion at how far their daughter had come. In the months that followed, Emma continued to thrive. She started kindergarten in a traditional classroom setting, something that would have been impossible 18 months earlier. She made friends. She participated in activities. She began to develop into a happy, resilient child who had experienced profound trauma but who was not defined by that trauma. Officer Chen continued his work with Duke, taking on cases involving traumatized children and helping them find their voices through the presence of a calm, trained animal. The partnership between officer and dog had become legendary in law enforcement circles. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Emma's case was the changed conversation around child testimony. Courtrooms across the nation began recognizing that traditional adversarial procedures were often counterproductive when dealing with traumatized children. Alternative approaches, including the presence of trained animals, began to be viewed not as gimmicks but as legitimate tools for accessing truth. On the 18th-month anniversary of the custody ruling, Emma sat in Dr. Torr's office and created another drawing. This one showed Emma as a much older girl, standing in front of a classroom full of children. The caption, written by Dr. Torrs at Emma's dictation, read, "When I grow up, I want to help other kids who are scared. I want to be like Duke." Judge Delacroix, when she heard about this drawing, smiled through tears. A traumatized child had not only found her voice, she had found her purpose. She had transformed her suffering into a desire to serve others. Justice had been served. Healing had begun. And one small girl's whispered confession to a police dog had changed the world.